For the evening, Anna Fifield. David.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks very much, Dick. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening and to have the privilege of serving as the moderator and to have the chance to introduce our distinguished speaker, someone known to you, known I'm sure to many people here as a journalist, an author, an editor, and in the best sense of the word, I think I can say a critic, Anna Fifield. And it's a pleasure to have the chance to introduce Anna. Anna grew up in the mighty Hawke's Bay and attended Hastings Girls High, where she wrote for the school newspaper and dreamed of once being an astronaut, but later of being a foreign correspondent. She wisely went on to study English at this wonderful university, University of Wellington, before going on to graduate study in journalism at the University of Canterbury. Her first job out of university was as a reporter for the branch office of the Rotorua Daily News, the Eastern Bay News, based in Whakatane, which some people would think was probably the best job in the world, before moving to Wellington and taking up a role with the New Zealand Press Association. In 2000, she spent a number of months in London on a British Council HSBC-funded fellowship, where she managed to finagle her way into volunteering for a small newspaper called the Financial Times. Her 3 months that she was supposed to have with the FT turned into 13 years, including 4 years based in Seoul, later as the FT's White House correspondent, before she took a year out to go to Harvard University as a Nieman Fellow. In 2014, she returned she went to the Washington Post as its Tokyo bureau chief, which allowed her to return to some of her experiences in North Korea. And based on her work and time there, she published her first book, The Great Successor, The Secret Rise and Rule of Kim Jong-un, which has now pretty remarkably been translated into 24 languages. Is it 24? Yeah. Anna then went on in her next role to be the Beijing bureau chief for the Washington Post, before in 2020, during the COVID pandemic, returning to New Zealand to become the editor of that other post, the Dominion Post. And in her time as editor of the Dom Post, she took on a number of targets. She called out misogyny. She took aim at what she called the communication industrial complex and spin doctors in the public service. She embraced te reo and, I think importantly for this audience tonight, really boosted the newspaper's coverage of international events, something that those of us in the capital were very grateful for. One of the more memorable of her headlines over her byline in her time there was, "No, Sir John Key, New Zealand is not like North Korea." And she also famously used the C word on the front page of the Dom Post. And unlike my 5-year-old son, who confessed to me that he'd once used the C word, it was not crap. In 2022, she rejoined the Washington Post as its Asia-Pacific editor, but happily for us, this is a role she will carry on and continue from right here in Wellington. We are delighted that Anna has agreed to give the NZIIA annual lecture for 2023 tonight on what is, I think, the great topic of our time, strategic competition between the United States and China and what that means for New Zealand. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Anna Fifield.
Thank you, David, for that very exhaustive introduction. Missed out what kindergarten I went to, but I will forgive you for that. And kia ora tātou, thank you so much for having me here as your speaker tonight. It's my great honour to be here. And I should, first of all, give two caveats to you. The first of all is that I am not a professor, I'm not an academic, I'm just a journalist, and so my remarks here will be based on my experiences out in the field and my experiences now as an editor in the throbbing Asian capital of Wellington, as you said. But also the other caveat I have to give you is to say that actually I'm a very optimistic person, realistically optimistic, I would say, a glass half full kind of person. And I need to say that to you because for the next 20 minutes I'm going to be very gloomy indeed. So brace yourself. So since you last had your AGM for NZIIA, the world has changed really dramatically. Japan has increased its defence spending markedly. The United States has announced 4 new military bases in the Philippines. The US, the UK and Australia have unveiled the outlines of its AUKUS submarine deal and invited us to talk about it. Finland has joined NATO. Sweden will soon. We've been invited to an expanded NATO meeting. Vladimir Putin has shown he will stop at nothing to try to eke out some kind of victory in Ukraine, or for that matter, to silence his rivals. And in China, Xi Jinping has cemented his grip on power and made it abundantly clear that China is no longer a one-party state, but is in fact now a one-person state. Together, Xi and Putin have been busy trying to make the world a place that is friendlier to autocrats. But while Putin is focused mostly on what's happening on Russia's borders, Xi Jinping has made it very clear that he has a much grander vision for the world. And that is one where he wants to reshape the international order and the principles and rules that have governed it for decades to make space for his kind of authoritarian system, and preferably at the top of that international order. I think we can probably say that for more than at any time since the fall of the Berlin Wall in the Soviet Union, the world has been divided into 2 camps. And this schism between democracies and autocracies, if you will, is what dominates my working day now as I oversee China coverage for a major American news outlet. And so that's what I would like to talk to you about today. I'd also like to talk a little about how it affects New Zealand and the challenges that I see ahead, because I think there is far too little discussion here in Aotearoa about China and about how we're going to deal with it as it carries out, as it makes good on this vision for the future, or at least tries to. Because I think it's really unrealistic to think that New Zealand will be able to continue to thread the needle in the way that we've been able to do up until now. Because the fact is that it's not about choosing sides. We have already chosen a side. We have chosen the side of democracy and the rules-based international order, the side of universal human rights. So first of all, I'll just turn to US-China relations. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that relations between these 2 superpowers are now at their lowest point since normalisation began in the 1970s. Indeed, the editor of The Economist went to Beijing recently for the first time in 4 years, and she said on a podcast that she'd wondered if her correspondent there was exaggerating things, was being unnecessarily gloomy. And she got back to the UK and put on the cover of the magazine, US versus China, it's worse than you think. And I agree, I think this division is only going to get worse over the next 18 months as the US heads into the next presidential election season. We can expect politicians to try to outdo each other to show how tough they are on China. Already some candidates, Nikki Haley in particular, are using phrases that sound a lot like calls for regime change in China. And it's really striking that in this very polarised American political environment where they can't agree on anything, that everybody is united in their hostility towards China and that antipathy there. And while these positions have hardened in the United States, this shift has been driven almost entirely by the changes in China, driven by the CCP under Xi Jinping. I think it's hard to grasp just how dramatically China has changed in the last 5 years in particular. It had been obvious for some time that the liberal democracy's hope was ill-founded, that WTO accession and greater integration into the world economy would bring about some kind of political easing, political change in China. I think the jig was up on that some time ago. But even a decade ago, when Xi Jinping took the helm in China, there remained some optimism that he would prove to be a reformer. Actually, there was that same optimism about Kim Jong-un, so they've both proven us wrong there. With Xi Jinping, those hopes dimmed fairly rapidly, but they were completely dispelled 5 years ago in 2018 when she changed the constitution to enable him to continue his role technically for life. He has completely dismantled the safeguards put in place after Mao Zedong, designed to stop one person amassing too much power. It was only last month that he cemented that change at a parliamentary hearing, and now he could potentially rule for the rest of his life. He's only 69, which makes him a youngster by American presidential candidate standards, so he could technically be there for a few more decades yet. And she has made his intentions for China extremely clear, more so over the past couple of years. He wants to see the rejuvenation of China as a great nation and for China to assume its rightful position at the top of the world. Within China, he's taken great steps to try to assimilate people and to get rid of any dissent. Over the past 5 years, he has dramatically reduced the public space. Human rights activists, lawyers, journalists, artists, academics, religious leaders, all of them have been silenced or detained or forced to flee. Just this week at the Washington Post, we've run a story about a journalist called Dong Yu, who worked inside the state system. He worked for a state a state newspaper, but was seen as one of the last remaining relatively liberal thinkers. And we just learned that in February last year, 3 months before he was going to retire, he was detained and hasn't been heard from since and is now on espionage charges. He was picked up for having lunch with a Japanese diplomat. So that's clearly a crime these days in Xi Jinping's China. Ethnic minorities have been forced to assimilate with the Han majority, not just in Xinjiang, but in Tibet and Inner Mongolia too. Xi Jinping has propagated a personality cult that would make Mao and Stalin proud, and the Kims next door too. He's stacked the Politburo with loyalists, so there's no naysayer around anymore to question him, and he's created or overseen the creation of a high-tech surveillance state that leaves no scope for dissent and where anyone can be picked up anywhere. He's exported the new Chinese model abroad through initiatives like the Belt and Road, militarised the South China Sea, created debt traps for many in the global south, just to name a few. So it's understandable that the United States and like-minded countries are extremely concerned about what's happening in China under Xi Jinping's Communist Party. But before you think I've drunk the DC Kool-Aid, let me just say that I don't think the United States has made a good case for why they are taking this incredibly hard line on China. It often looks like their actions on things like semiconductors are driven by a desire to maintain American preeminence in the global economic system and to thwart China's development. When it comes to China's efforts to build alliances and institutions, Washington hasn't explained why it's wrong for China to do what the United States did after World War II. They haven't articulated a vision for a world order in the next decade or two. It all seems to be about keeping China down. This, of course, has enabled Beijing to portray America as being a bully. Indeed, Xi recently said that Western countries, led by the United States, have implemented all-round containment and suppression of China. This was really notable because he named the United States by name, which he doesn't usually do. But clearly, that broader group of Western countries also includes countries like us. And the CCP has a lot of material to support its contention that the United States is being a bully, hell-bent on keeping Chinatown down. Just take the extraordinary scenes from the TikTok hearing on Capitol Hill. I don't know whether any of you saw those, but really gobsmacking stuff, where one lawmaker even accused China of conducting psychological warfare on American children. So understandably, Beijing sees the US as hell-bent on maintaining a unipolar world. China, on the other hand, is now putting forward a vision for a multipolar world, and they have a fair amount of support for that vision, not just from Russia, But Brazil's Lula was just in Beijing and sounding very supportive of this New World Order. South Africa is increasingly cozying up to both China and Russia, even going so far this week as to opt out of the ICC so they don't have to arrest Putin if he travels to South Africa. And in India, Modi also has clear authoritarian tendencies and has presided over this dramatic shrinking of freedom of the press in particular. I saw a report this week that 19 countries have applied to join Brazil, Russia, India and China in the BRICS bloc. They might not be global powerhouses, but still 19 is a really big number. Unfortunately, I told you this was going to be gloomy, I don't see that the situation is going to get better anytime soon. In fact, I think it could quite easily get a whole lot worse. Because although I think total decoupling is impossible, there will certainly be damage to globalisation and to export-led economies like our own, as this effort to bring about decoupling and like the Americans putting pressure on countries like Japan and Netherlands to join forces on semiconductors, as we see more and more of that coming to bear. I also think the risk of military conflict in the Taiwan Strait is very real. A lot of people in DC think that Xi has a timetable for making a bid to take control of Taiwan, but I don't think that's the case. I think he needs a level of flexibility, that he doesn't want to be locked in to 2027 or 2029 or whatever the various dates are that go around. But instead, I think the risk of accidental conflict is even more real than ever. There have been multiple near misses, including in December when a Chinese fighter jet flew within 20 feet of an American plane. Just in the latest round of military drills in response to Tsai Ing-wen's visit to the United States, China for the first time practiced attacking Taiwan from the eastern coast, the Pacific side, which has traditionally been the military domain of the United States. But most alarmingly at all, the usual mechanisms for communication, the hotlines, the guardrails there to be able to stop an accidental conflict have almost entirely broken down because of this broader difficulties in the relationship. And it's here where I think things could get really, really challenging for New Zealand. Because if there is a military conflict, I think it's inevitable that we will be drawn in. There will be an expectation from our security partners that we will play our part. Our export markets and our supply chains will definitely be affected. And even if there is not a conflict, or if not for a long time to come, we are increasingly going to be tested by China's newfound assertiveness. We're already seeing that playing out in our backyard in the Pacific, with the security deal in the Solomons and other efforts around the place to have an influence across the Pacific and the build-up that may come with that. We may also very well suffer the kind of economic coercion that some of our allies have experienced at the hands of China. We haven't been subject to the kind of trade embargoes that Australia and Canada have, but that could easily change, and I think we'll be relatively unprotected if that was going to happen, because Australia has things that China wants and can't get elsewhere, like minerals, whereas we, New Zealand, produce milk powder and meat and other commodities that China does have other options for. So I think that that is a real risk for us. At the same time, if China supplies Russia with arms, and I don't think that's beyond the realms of possibility, given Xi's interest in making sure that Putin does not fail or does not suffer an embarrassing defeat, then our new sanctions regime will surely be put to the test. We found it easy to impose sanctions on Russia and Belarus, and very quickly as well. It was remarkable how that changed. But I think it would be a very different story if we had to apply them to our largest trading partner. So the thing that really concerns me a lot is that there is relatively little discussion in New Zealand about how to deal with this challenge, how to accept China as it is in the world and not China as we wish it to be. In my previous role at the Dominion Post, I tried really hard to generate a public discussion about how New Zealand should be thinking about and managing the relationship with China. And we have some academics who are really promoting this public conversation and being very provocative in some respects. Nick Koo recently wrote a very punchy piece making the case for New Zealand to at least talk about joining AUKUS in some way. Obviously, David Capie, very important contribution, and Jason Young, shout out there as well, for this public discussion on what we should do about New Zealand and China. But it seems to me like our government and our corporate sector is positively allergic to talking about China. It's very, very difficult to get anything tangible out of these, the government or the corporate sector on what to do and how we are dealing with, thinking about, planning for what our contingencies are with China. We get a few very carefully scripted statements from our foreign minister or from the prime minister, but with very little opportunity to pad that out, to ask questions and to really look into what's happening. Last year's bold new initiative was to add "and stability in the Taiwan Strait" to our pro forma statements on what's happening with China. This to me is very striking given the recalibration that's going on in other parts of the world. What is our plan B if there is a military conflict with China? If we come under trade retaliation, what would decoupling mean for New Zealand businesses? And what can we do to mitigate it? I actually don't know the answer to any of these questions because I don't see that kind of robust public discussion that even Australia is having about China and what to do there. And I think we don't serve our interests well by being too afraid to have robust public discussions about these things. I think we can certainly be very smart and do them in a much less shrill and much less extreme way than the US and Australia under Scott Morrison did. And we can make sure to make clear that we are talking about Xi Jinping and the CCP and not about Chinese people either there or here. But I'm also concerned at the wider lack of communication between the United States and China in particular. Kurt Campbell, the Indo-Pacific czar in the White House, said that the era of engagement is over, and that seems to be almost pretty absolute at the moment. I was in DC in January, and there was a lot of hope then that Secretary of State Blinken's visit to Beijing would lead to an easing of tensions, and that was something that I had a particularly strong interest in because the Washington Post has no China correspondents in China. Everybody is on the outside, so we were hoping for visas as a result of that trip. And we had reason to believe that it would make some progress in lowering the tensions because we'd seen how the meeting between Biden and Xi in Bali at the end of last year had lowered the temperature significantly. And there was a move underway to talk about developing guardrails for the relationship. But of course, that was all spectacularly brought down by that rogue balloon, something we could never have foreseen at that time. And calls between defence ministers went unanswered. Blinken cancelled his trip at exactly the time I would have said that communication was more important than ever. For that reason, I think it's fantastic that Foreign Minister Mahuta did go to Beijing last month and did have what I hear was a pretty robust conversation, especially on the Chinese side at that time. But keeping those lines of communication open and being able to speak to each other is more important than ever. It's now become cliched to talk about being in a new Cold War, and I generally do think that's unhelpful, not least because China is far more integrated into the world economy now than the Soviet Union ever was. But I think there's one really crucial lesson that we can learn from that time. The world came extremely close to nuclear catastrophe, but the Cold War didn't turn into a hot one because there were processes for managing rivalry and conflict. And that's why right now I'm very concerned about the breakdown in mechanisms that kept us safe during the Cold War and how they do not seem to be there now. And so for New Zealand and its role in this, I am hoping that we can more adequately discuss what happens, what our contingencies are to get over this allergy to talking about China for fear that we might annoy China in some way. If the relationship really is as mature as they say it is, that we should be able to speak frankly to them about these things. Because the fact is that our values are diametrically opposed with China's values, even as our economic interests coincide. And it's inevitable that they will clash at some stage. But the question for us is, will we be ready to deal with it? I told you I'd be gloomy. That's it.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Anna. For a self-professed optimist, that was indeed I would have hate to have heard a pessimist up here. But you gave us, an enormous amount to think about. We've got about 20 minutes or so for questions and answers and discussion. But I wonder if I could start the ball rolling. And that is to bring together the two parts of the story you talked about. One of China-US competition, but secondly, thinking about it through the lens of the media. You are somebody who has spent a lot of time in Northeast Asia and now has a responsibility for all your bureaus in that part of the world. Yeah. What is it even like covering China now as one of the world's great newspapers? What are the limitations? What are the challenges in terms of actually telling stories or broadening our understanding of what's going on?
Yeah, thank you, David. One of the reasons, the main reason I left China at the end of 2020 was not because of COVID, but it was because I wasn't able to do what I went there to do, which was to report, to talk to ordinary people, to tell human stories about daily life and how people live and that kind of humanity that brings us all together, because the environment had become so restricted. People were afraid to talk to me, even if I could find people who, on the street or without being, obstructed by some plainclothes goon in the way. So it had become very difficult. And so I left at that time. 20 or so American correspondents were expelled that year. And then with the COVID restrictions and 3 years of closed borders, a lot of correspondents left and then couldn't get back in again. So what that means now is for the Washington Post, we have 7 people in our China team. None of them are in China. They are in Taipei, they are in Seoul and Hong Kong. Our efforts to get anyone back in have not been successful because it's caught up in this greater political tit-for-tat. The New York Times managed to get 2 people back in, but down from 12 usually. This is particularly bad for American media, but it's really across the board. The Guardian has no correspondent in China. The Daily Telegraph closed its bureau after decades there because it has become so difficult and so dangerous. Journalists are getting detained and arrested and not seen for a long time, including foreign journalists. So now the way we do it is I have this team mostly in Taipei, and they are making a lot of phone calls, reading a lot of social media. It's gone back to like the 70s, reading Xinhua, state media, tea leaves, that kind of thing. Everything is much more laborious. It's harder to get real people. And this, for me, is really, really alarming because the stories, therefore, tend to become much more about this hard stuff, the militarization, the scary China stuff, and we don't get the story of the, little plucky entrepreneur in the countryside who made an aeroplane from scratch out of farm parts, or those kind of really fun slice of life stories that shed a light on the humanity and remind us that it's not a nation of 1.4 billion Xi Jinping. So trying to tell those stories and keep the humanity in the coverage has become really, really difficult, but is something that I think as media we bear a very strong responsibility for that, and not to perpetuate or feed into this narrative that everything about China is bad, because that's certainly not the case.
Your newspaper published an op-ed by Max Boot, a pretty well-known sort of think tanker commentator, a couple of months ago, where he said He said that not everything about bipartisanship is not an unalloyed good. In some things, it's good to have a clash of opinions and a clash of views. And he was talking about views on China in the US, where he was saying there's almost it's how as you said, trying to out-hawk one another. Sometimes there's in terms of thinking back to your experiences here as well, where you lamented the sort of a lack of a debate. How do you actually generate a proper, a clash of views, a back and forth, a rich debate in the media?
I think I failed to do that, so I'm the wrong person to ask. Part of it is, I think there is a lot of interest in New Zealand in these geopolitical issues, especially as what's happening in our backyards. And I know from seeing the click count on some of the pieces that people wrote during the series we've had, or various other things about China-New Zealand relations, or why we should care about Taiwan and these explanatory things. There's a lot of interest, and they perform very well. They hold their own against the cat stories. But I think that in this constrained media environment, it's really hard to get media outlets to devote a whole job to writing about New Zealand's place in the world, or foreign relations, or that kind of thing. So thank God we have Sam Suchdeva. I did often think about whether I could clone him to come to stuff as well, or several of them over. But I think that's the problem. It's not valued in the media environment. Not enough cats in foreign policy.
And then finally, one more question before I turn it open to the floor. You're an optimist. You painted a very bleak picture of the world. What gives you cause for hope or optimism when you think about New Zealand's situation in this increasingly contested world? What are the things that we can try and take some comfort from, or resources that we have as a country that give us opportunities to find space to navigate or to maximise opportunities? Yeah.
This is not directly comparable, but one thing that did make me two things that made me feel very optimistic about hard changes possible during my previous job was, one, when I went to Kapiti Island and saw the great regeneration of bird life there, and that was something that should have been extinct. The other is the revival of te reo in New Zealand and how that's become completely normal part of daily life. So we are, as a country, able to move and do difficult things. How we apply that to the world at large is much, much more difficult, I think, and especially like when we look at companies in New Zealand who've been talking for a very long time about the need to diversify away from China, to not have all their eggs in that basket. I think they've made almost no progress. It may have even got worse on that. So I think that being able... I've fallen into the trap of being pessimistic again. I can't immediately off the top of my head think of something that is going to be optimistic on that. I think that there are areas, though... even this is going to be pessimistic.
That's okay.
There are areas like where we have shared interests on climate change, on pandemic preparedness, on some of those things where there is a clear international interest in all being on the same page. And I think that's where New Zealand has done really well in emphasising the areas of overlap, not just the areas of concern. So the more we can do that, hopefully, and to continue to build that trust so that we can have the tough talks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Anna. Okay, I'm going to open it up, and I've got a hand up there. And if you just wait for a second while somebody will bring you a microphone. Thank you.
Kia ora, Anna. Thank you so much for your lecture. I'd like to get your opinion on the future of the New Zealand-Australia relationship from a defence perspective. I was at the National Security Conference a couple of weeks ago in Auckland, and someone asked one of the speakers, what do we do if shit hits the fan, so to speak, with Chinese expansion? This might be like 15, 20 years longer down the line, very theoretical. But they asked the question anyway, and the speaker said, federalise with Australia. And then everyone laughed, and they said, no, I'm dead serious. That solves all your defence problems. And he brought up an old joke about what's the difference between Tasmania and New Zealand, 12 seats in Parliament. So this kind of dynamic, there's the Hugh White school of thought in Australia that's kind of actually taking the lead now in their defence policy, which is just up the budget, up the budget, up the budget. What's New Zealand to do in a world where perhaps the US has pulled out, or at least kind of reduced their commitment to the Asia Pacific, especially the South Pacific? How do we lean on Australia, in your opinion? What might that world look like? What are the pros and cons for us? Thanks.
I don't feel like I have a great answer to that question, except that I'm against federalisation. I think, it's interesting that this invitation has been extended to us around AUKUS, and I do think it's good that we have a discussion about that and some of the non-submarine related parts of it, the AI or the whatever comes up in Pillar 2, where there might be some overlap. But I think that we need to continue to pursue our own interests and do what's best for us, especially in the Pacific now. And I can't see that those submarines are going to be in our interest at all. So, yeah, I don't have a great answer on that question, I'm sorry to say. David, do you?
No. I'm here to facilitate, and I'm not falling into that trap. Nice try. Suze Jessup, please.
Softball, Suze.
Anna, thank you so much for your fantastic remarks. My question is really about democracy, and David in some way has already asked it, but I wonder if I can extend the question. At a time of, as you noted, rising autocracy and nationalism, and being a media specialist, what, in your view, does that active, rowdy public discourse deliver in terms of New Zealand foreign policy? I understand that it delivers in terms of democracy, it delivers in terms of us understanding where we might sit on a political spectrum, but it seems, and certainly the lessons from Australia has been that the rowdy, it's not going to be New Zealand that decides our fate in this particular relationship. It's going to be China deciding. And so I wonder what the benefit is of having that rowdy discourse, like sort of airing your laundry, if we're not the decision taker ultimately.
I think we can differentiate between having a robust public discussion and having a rowdy airing of laundry. I think I would hope that there would be a difference between those two. What I was meaning was more about, yes, being able to play out options, to have discussions about what we should do, what the contingencies should be, what's worked in other countries, what hasn't, what we can learn from that, how these new alliances are forming in the world. So I think just having a more robust debate and having a variety of voices on that as well would be beneficial to New Zealand. I don't think it serves our interests well to not have that kind of debate, especially like at times like this when things are relatively, on a good simmer. We're okay, but what are we doing to prepare the New Zealand public and to educate them to think about some of these decisions or some of these things that may happen to us that we have very little agency over when they come in the future? So to prepare for, yes, conflict in the Taiwan Strait and what our role in that could be. And, I think we wouldn't be able to opt out of that. So I think that kind of more public education and just explaining our position on things, it's really struck me how relatively little or how officials don't want to talk about what New Zealand is doing in the Pacific in particular, where China has clearly got a lot of designs across the region and is moving in quite aggressively, and why we are not talking more robustly about what we are doing, what our interests are, and what kind of order we would like to see in that region. Yeah.
Takuma.
Hi, Anna. Thanks so much for the talk. You mentioned a lack of hotline sort of between the US and China as one reason for your concern. I guess out of curiosity, what would you make of the claim that New Zealand could possibly play a unique role and that we have a level of open dialogue with China distinct from the US and Australia, as you've characterised.
So New Zealand could be a kind of mediator or go-between?
Yeah, exactly. As we have sort of maintained a unique stance so far.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that New Zealand is actually pretty useful to China in many ways. But having said that, I think that I'm not sure the US would go for it, but I'm also not sure that China would go for it, because China enjoys being able to have those levers or to be able to drive a wedge between the US and other countries and things. So I'm not sure that directly would work, but it's certainly in multilateral settings or where we can play a facilitator role or something, I think that would be good. I think there's probably there has been a lot of concern in Australia in particular about New Zealand's stance on China, so I'm not sure. I think that's probably changed under Albanese, but I'm not sure that all the sides would go for it, or if we would. Interesting idea, though.
Gentleman up the back there.
Is China matured enough to be a relational power in the international community?
A what power in the international community?
A relational power, wherein a reliable partner of the international community. Is China matured enough?
I don't know.
At least in the future?
I don't know if it's a question of mature enough. Is China mature enough to be a reliable partner in the international community? I think they are not reliable, because everything they do is about China and China's position in the world and what is good for China. So the position on Ukraine, Russia is about what is good for China. It is not good for China for Putin to fail. It is not good for China for Ukraine to, or for the international community to come in to support Ukraine because they look at Taiwan. So I think that so much of what China does, whether it's Belt and Road projects, whether it's giving technology to countries and things, is a lot about pursuing their economic and political interests in various countries. I think they're not doing things because out of altruism or other reasons like that.
Yeah, please.
My name is David Swartz. I wanted to ask you about the role of the United Nations, which was set up in 1945, especially to avoid the horrors of the Second World War. You've made it clear that you think China's one aim is to be top dog in the world, and the United Nations, with its Security Council veto powers, seems not to have been able to do anything to prevent different great powers from manipulating the Security Council to their own purposes. Do you think that the UN and the Security Council will be able to be constructive in what you have described as the future with China's aims?
Thank you for your question, David. I believe you're a Dominion Post subscriber, right? I remember your name. I have the list. I think it's hard to see. I think that there are many areas where the UN can still be constructive and contribute. Climate change is an obvious one. But I think on these big questions of China, Russia, the fact that China and Russia have vetoes mean that nothing's ever going to get through the Security Council, right? And we've already seen that multiple times over the past year. We saw it multiple times on Iran, on Syria, on North Korea, all these kinds of things. So when it comes to dealing with those issues, the schism that I was talking about plays out very clearly and really hamstrings, is that the word? No. Holds back the United Nations from being able to do a lot of things. So I think that's why we're seeing different alliances and different bodies come out. But I can't see that the UN Security Council would ever change, would it? Like, why would wouldn't be in anybody's interest to get more people on there or to take Russia or China off? Wouldn't be in Russia or China's interest to not have that veto power. So I'm not sure that I see any great change or great recourse to come through the UN.
Mandy.
Thanks, Anna. I'm Mandy, a student at Victoria University. My question is about your depictions of the two clubs, autocracy and democracy. You seems to agree there's a description of narratives in the medium separating the words between autocracy and democracy, but we also noticed the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern gave a speech last year, if I remember right, the speech in Sydney. She think it's not good idea to separate the words between autocracy and democracy. My question is, I wonder how you think the difference in politicians' narrative and the medium narrative in this question. Yeah.
Thank you, Mandy. That's a good question. I think she may well have been right that it's not good or helpful to describe the world in those terms, but I think it's the reality. I think that is, obviously liberal democracies like us believe in liberal democracy and everything that comes with it in terms of all the freedoms and the human rights that come with being in that system. But I think what we've very clearly seen is this attempt by Putin and Xi in particular to create a global environment that is more friendly to autocrats, whether it's the two of them, whether it's Lukashenko, whether it's, Modi, some of these other people, Erdogan, people around the place. So I think that while it might not be helpful, it is happening. And again, you have to deal with the world as it is, not as we want it to be. So I hope that answers your question.
James Kemper.
I think I'll probably speak loudly enough anyway without the microphone.
One's coming to you, James.
Other side, James.
Thanks, Anna. A very sobering take, I must say. I want to come on to your comments about Hong Kong, because I sort of wonder whether there's a bit of pendulum swing and whether one might hope that the pendulum might one day swing back the other way. But when you were talking about the move of journalists to places like Taipei and Hong Kong, I'm reminded that in my first posting in Hong Kong in the 1970s, it was full of China watchers because that was the only place you could be. And the Far Eastern Economic Review was the mainstay of the watching. Now you've got your Washington Post person based, or some of them based in Hong Kong. How long is that going to last? Does Xi Jinping care about Hong Kong? We used to think that Hong Kong was safe for 50 years. Well, that was a pipe dream. Yeah. Is that going to be trampled on in search of a bigger objectives? And are people going to have to get out of Hong Kong too?
Yeah. Xi Jinping cares a lot about Hong Kong. I think he's made that pretty clear over the past few years with everything he's done since the pro-democracy protests there. There has been a sudden constriction in the media environment in Hong Kong as well. And in fact, the 20 Americans who were expelled from China at the beginning of 2020 were told specifically they also could not go to Hong Kong. So that was ruled out to them. And since the introduction of the national security law in Hong Kong, which criminalises publishing content that China considers objectionable, a lot of news organisations have moved editors out of Hong Kong, where they had big editing bureaus there, because they are the ones who publish and could therefore fall afoul of those rules. So while lots of organisations, including my own, have a person, it's a reporter who is in Hong Kong and is just doing reporting, and the people who push the buttons are all in Seoul for both New York Times and for us. So that has changed a lot. And so I think that Hong Kong's place is the place where you watch China. Those days are probably almost entirely over for a lot of people because of these restrictions, because it has become more difficult. Journalists have been denied visas because they're considered unfavourable to the system. I do think Taipei is not the best place to be watching China, just as in many ways South Korea is not the best place to be watching North Korea. You know, each of these places has their own domestic political environments and their own views and ways of looking at things. So, yeah, none of it is ideal, but that's the way that things have shaken out at the moment. And yeah, well, I do hope I'll get one correspondent back into Beijing. I think that this is going to be the way it's going to be for some time to come, just trying to make the best of this situation. And because I think that it really works for China to be in this situation. They don't want journalists running around Hong Kong or mainland China reporting on, you know, camps in Xinjiang or talking to ordinary people or doing any of these things. They just want enough people who are there to go to the foreign ministry every afternoon at 3:00 and take dictation from the Wolf Warrior spokesman. And that's it. That's what they've reduced them to. And it's really only the financial press that has still been able to get people into China because they serve some utility for China. But for the rest of us, pesky. Yeah.
I've got two more questions to come. I'm going to cut the list off there, I'm afraid, because time is running out. But I've got Ruben and then over here, please. So, Ruben.
Thank you, Anna. I liked your optimistic pessimism a lot. My name is Ruben Azizian, and I'm used to be a subscriber of Dominion without the post.
Okay.
So my question is, can you elaborate a little bit on what you refer to if Putin fails? China doesn't want Putin to fail. Is it a fear of losing another authoritarian ally, or is it about something else? Because China successfully survived the breakup of USSR. I mean, Putin could be replaced by someone who can continue good relationship with China. And there's another perspective that actually a weaker Russia suits China because, after all, as you said, China thinks about China. And we know there are some territorial issues about the eastern part. There is a greater influence of China in eastern. So what is exactly failure of Putin for you that will make China nervous?
Yeah, thank you, Ruben. I think it's anything but a success there, and success in achieving his aims would be humiliating for a big country like Putin and send shockwaves through Beijing for that same reason, that this big power has not been able to prevail over this little country next door, which used to be part of it. There's a lot of similarities there from Beijing's perspective. So I think he wants, for territorial reasons, for East versus West reasons, or these NATO containment reasons, he wants to see Putin eke out some kind of victory and for that system that they both espouse to be vindicated in some way. So I think that's a big part of his rationale, and that he has an interest in that, which is why I think it's possible that they will step in to supply arms or some kind of aid to Russia if it looks like they are going to fail there. There was a second part of the question that I've forgotten. But yeah. I think that China is very clearly the senior partner in this relationship now. Like, look at the whole vibe from Xi's visit to Moscow. So I don't think he needs to worry about that so much. But also, I cannot speculate what will happen if Putin suddenly is not in power anymore. There's too many hypotheticals for me, and I'm not a Russia person.
Okay, I'm sorry to the people who haven't had a chance to ask a question, but last question over here.
Kia ora. Thank you, Anna, for your presentation, and David for facilitation. And I'm just wondering if you might be able to speak to the utility of the term independent foreign policy and how well agreed that is by the various stakeholders in New Zealand. Full disclosure, I'm from the Aussie Embassy, sorry.
Yes. I think... can you take that? I think we do have an independent foreign policy, and we have been able to make our decisions about when we sign with Five Eyes and when we don't, even if the statements are pretty much the same. And we have been able to carve out this place where we have not fallen into the same trap as Australia and the UK and Canada and that kind of thing, and have been able to focus more on the conciliatory. But I think a lot of the time, independent foreign policy is used kind of as a shield or something in a way to absolve us from having to do things, or to protect ourselves from some way, from making difficult decisions. So as a principle, I'm all for it. In practice, I think it can sometimes be a little bit wobbly.
Well, I'm afraid time has raced by, and I'm sorry to those people who haven't had a chance to ask their questions, but perhaps you'll have a chance to ask it when this concludes afterwards. But I'd now like to ask Dick Grant to come and give a vote of thanks.
Yes.
My job's to propose the vote of thanks, which I'm very happy to do. I was just reflecting as Anna spoke that it is so reassuring to see that New Zealand still produces journalists like her in the tradition that goes back a long, long way. Geoffrey Cox, Jim Bertram, Peter Arnett, others, her contemporaries, Jamie Landolini, without New Zealanders getting out there to succeed, which of course is what Anna has done, but without New Zealanders getting out there to tell New Zealanders what the world looks like, we would be very much poorer. So please join me in thanking Anna. It's been an honour and a privilege to have you to give our annual you are all invited back out into the foyer to have another drink. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you all for attending the annual lecture of the Institute of International Affairs. Good night.
outbreak crossed my mind that the Chinese we're worried about the Iranian. So the institutions should start talking to the Iranians about the story. Most immediately crossed my mind, what are the Chinese up to getting this stuff lost? My immediate picture, lots of dark accounts to the
We have our Kippenberg.
Yeah, I've got the invite.
Good, you can come.
Oh,
He's very good.
That'd be good.
Smart, very thoughtful guy.
Yeah, he's the English going back and cutting missions.
No, I think he's pretty hard on both sides. So yeah,
I'm signed up.
Good. I know, there's so much to do. Yeah, no, I've got to find a way. Right now I'm in research. I'm playing travel agent. That's where I've gone. I do research. Yeah. No, you're ahead of the curve there. Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I mean, I was talking to Jason about this because he's got the same challenges. Are you sticking around for a minute? I'll see. I was thinking of you this afternoon. Jason's got the same. We like one sentence.
Yeah.
That's a fire. Will do. They haven't announced it yet.
Response Josh at the top of the how much is it cost?
Well, it started off. I think it was. They've already had to increase the funding by about a quarter of the projected total. Yeah. I mean, it's also like. I mean, Guildford bought that massive building on the terrace. You know, that empty hull. People all built brand new building there. He said, and it's built these other ones. Now suddenly it's space. There's actually much less important than the teaching environment than it was 5 years ago. And then they've lost a fortune on this enrollment system. They lost like $20 million on the IT system. Yeah. So Yeah, well, it's hard to read, right? I tell you, hard to. I heard that. I've really got to watch it. You're one tweet away from a whole new career. I know. Nice to see you, Rod.
Thank you. I just want to grab the Rod. Nice to meet you. Hello. I do. Yeah, I know Louise.
She was with the ABC for quite a while.
Yes, and then she's BBC, right?
She was with the BBC. Now she's changed jobs. She's now digitalising the Australian archive. Based in Sydney, two young grandsons.
Yes, I met them. Yeah, I saw them when I went to Sydney one time, I think.
They're doing great.
Yeah.
She's fine. Oh, yes, she's
Yeah, please say hi. And I got quite a lot of correspondence with Lisbon when I was in my last job. Please give her my regards as well.
Did you pick up this thing on the Americans?
Oh, yeah. Extended to terrorists.
Generally worried about what the screens are saying.
Yes, they genuinely were. It had been such a dramatic shift. But without going, like, agreed with one of them to promise to avoid use.
The other thing is to sort of sleep program. My thoughts Chinese say to them, right, Australians hand on heart and say that's not going to upset the FT. The thing has been broken. You'd like us to persuade the Iranians not to be thinking about breaking that loophole. The Saudis, what's it worth to you to start talking about political corruption? Is it interests? With the bargaining chip?
You've got all that. Yeah. That's right. I mean, that took everybody by surprise. Saudi, Iran.
Well, they've been working like fire.
Yeah, they have.